We can move on by setting up some of the assets. So I can go to the texture group, and we can begin by looking into the material system. So we can open Barrick 01_D_mat, and this is a material that has not been set up. You can see it's black. I did this intentionally so we can set it up. You can open that. See, it's completely empty. And the first thing we should do is we should take the texture that we want to use. So that's Barrick 01_D. Select that, go back to the material editor, and we can simply hold the T key, T from Thomas, on the keyboard, click and hold, and you get a texture sample. Alternatively, you can also look it up in here. You can look up a texture sample, this one, and simply drag this in. There we go. Okay, and then we hook this up to diffuse. So we click the little black box and drag, so we have a line, and you hook it up to diffuse. Now the thing is, pretty much everything you do with expressions here is useless, because the mobile system cannot use this. What the mobile system actually uses is down in the properties at the bottom. So if you make sure you select nothing, click in the empty area, you can see you have a section called mobile here. And this section is what the mobile system actually uses. So you would actually be able to get away with simply deleting it over here and using just these properties at the bottom. The only reason why we add it over here is because otherwise we wouldn't be able to see it in the viewport. So what we should do now is we should take the same texture, this texture, and also enter it in the properties at the bottom. So I'm in the mobile section, and we have a mobile base texture. So this is where we are adding the texture that's going to use. And for a very basic material, which this is pretty much it. You don't have to do anything else, because you don't really want to set any specular or emissive or environment or anything like that on most of your materials. It's too heavy. You want to keep everything as simple as possible. Alternatively, you could add a normal map to it. It's not going to appear on the device, but Unreal might be able to bake it into the light map. And this is what they did in the Citadel demo. So they're actually baking the normal maps into the light map. So it still looks somewhat normal map-ish, but it definitely isn't the normal map. It's just a very good light map. So this is pretty much it. We have it hooked up, and we can simply close this. Would you like to apply the changes? Yes. And that's pretty much it for a very simple material. We can do this again for a couple of other materials, a couple more complicated materials. For example, we have the tree over here. So it's called tree_mat. This is the material used on the trees. These. This one is a bit more complicated because first of all it has emissive, and secondly it's a mask texture. So you can open this one. Again, it's empty. So we're going to add the texture we want to use first. So it's simply called tree. We hook it up to diffuse. It has an alpha map, so we hook that up to opacity mask. And then we click in the empty white area, go to material, and there you see blend mode. Should set this to masked. There we go, and as you can see, it's now a mask 3. That's good. That's it, and then we should add this to the mobile section as well. So I'm copying the texture name, going to the mobile section. It's the base texture, and we don't really have to set the masking texture here, because what it will do is it will automatically detect the alpha map because it's set to masked. So this will already appear as a mask texture on iPhone simply because this has an alpha map and because this is all the blend mode is set to masked. So that's easy. However, I'd also like to add an emissive texture to this. And the reason why I'm doing that is because without an emissive texture, I can't really show this yet because I have no lighting in the scene so far, but without an emissive texture, this side of the trees would be dark and this side would be light. You know, it's this very, very common problem. So what I'm doing is I'm adding a very faint, subtle emissive texture, which is basically just a tree again, a bit darker than the original one, and lower resolution. And I'm adding that on top of it, so that the other side, the shadow side of the trees, doesn't become completely dark, but is a bit more similar to the bright side. I'm trying to avoid having a very harsh contrast. So I'm going to emissive, and I add my emissive texture in mobile emissive texture. That's it. You don't really have to do anything else over here. Just add a texture and that's it. Might also be able to add a texture over here. So connecting that to emissive. That's it. I'm going to save the package. And we can move on by setting up the material for the terrain. So we have two textures here, two materials, ground 1 and ground 2. So I actually believe ground 2 might be already set up. Yes, I kept this one, so you only have to set up ground 1. And what we're going to do here is we're going to vertex blend it together. We're going to use the vertex colors that are on this mesh. You can't see it, but there are actually vertex color information on this mesh, which I painted in Max. And this vertex color information is going to do the blending of the textures. So what we should do is we should get both of the textures we want to use, and that would be ground 1. And that would be the rock. So the rock texture, we get both of those textures in here. And then we use a lerp, linear interpolate. So we can just type that, linear interpolate. You can also hold the L key on the keyboard, click somewhere, and you also get a lerp. And you hook these two up. Thing is, I always forget which one is which, so might have the wrong order here, but we'll find out. Then we need the vertex color. So we have a vertex color. And we hook up one of the colors of the vertex color. It kind of depends on which color I paint it with. And I always mix these up as well. So I think green might work. And you hook this up to diffuse. Now, it's not going to be pretty, probably, but for a first go, it works. You can see I changed them around, so I managed yet again to flip them around, but it works. You can see this blends over into the rock texture. The only thing is the other way around, so let's fix that. Okay, so that works. This is what I want to have. Nice blending from one texture to the other. Also, what I did is I put the ground on a different UV channel. And I did that to prevent these seams from occurring. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to tell the grass to operate on the second UV channel. And to do that, I need to have a texture coordinate. Adding that behind the grass, hooking it into the UV input. And then in text coord, I set coordinate index. It should now be the second one. So that's 1, since we're start to count from 0. And then we have no more seam. So that's nice. Now we have to make sure that the same system, the same thing we've done here, is also set up for mobile. Because again, everything we've done here is just to make sure it looks pretty in the viewport, but it's not going to work on the device. So we take the first texture we want to use, rock, and we go down to the mobile section, and we enter this as the base texture. And then we take the second texture that we want to use, so that would be ground. And again, I always mix up these as well. So it might be that the base texture should be ground, and the other texture should be rock, but you can find out later. Okay, so then we take the second texture, which is in my case ground, and I go to texture blending, and here I have mobile detail texture. So I make the ground the mobile detail texture. You can see mobile detail texture text chord source, and this is 1. This is correct, because I've done the same thing here. I set this to 1 as well. And you can see it now says 1 over here. If in the event that this should be the rock texture, and this instead should have been the grass texture, then you should set this to 1, and this to 0 instead. So then it's the other way around. That's correct. And here it says mobile texture blend factor source. So basically what's controlling the blending, and that says vertex color, and that's correct. So this is by default correct. You could set it to a mask texture, and then you would have an alpha map to control where which texture appears. But for our case, vertex color is correct. That's it. Another feature you can use when doing materials for mobile is you are actually able to use the expressions, and then you're able to output a flattened result from that and use that new flattened texture. I can demonstrate that with, for example, let's pick something useful. For example, we have these tracer underscore mat. Let's duplicate this just for the sake of the example, because I don't actually have to do this. But for the sake of example, let's test this. Call this flatten test. Okay, so what this is, this tracer material, it's meant for a particle. So it's meant for like a tracer from airplane fire. And it's currently orange. Actually, the texture itself is, I believe, even though it is actually orange, yes. So I've done this in Photoshop. But what if you would like to have a red tracer instead of an orange tracer? Then you could go back to Photoshop, modify it over there, and then import a new texture. Or you can do the exact same thing in the editor. For the engine, there is really no difference. It costs the same amount of memory, it takes the same amount of space, everything is the same. It's really just about what you prefer and what is easier at that time. So I can make the editor actually change the color of this and output a new texture based on my expressions. And if I would like to do that, I could, for example, make constant 3 vector. So that's a constant 3 vector. For the number 3 on the keyboard, hold it and click somewhere. So a constant 3 vector is nothing more but a flat single color. So I connect that to emissive instead. And now, depending on the number I enter here, I get a different color. See? So I can say, okay, I'd like to have a red tracer instead. So now I've recolored this. Problem is, if I input the original texture in the mobile section down here, it's still going to be yellow because this simply is yellow. So to work around that, I can say the following. I can enable auto flatten mobile, and by enabling this and approving the material, what it actually does is it actually makes a new texture that's pretty much a screenshot of the end result. So it basically outputs what you're doing in the expressions here. It outputs that and saves it as a texture. And you can then use that texture as the mobile base texture. You can see this is the texture it made by itself. So you can also use that. I often use this to make particles and smoke and to make variations on textures. Because it's kind of sometimes easier to do that in here rather than going back to Photoshop, save yet another file, and so on. The only problem with this is that for some reason it always makes it a black background. And you don't really want to have that. For a texture like this, for example, you don't want to have a black background, because you might see some of the blackness, some of the black color leaking through in the end result. You might see a subtle black line around the shape, for example. What you normally should do with a texture like this is make the entire RGB image the same color, and then instead focus on the alpha channel. So it's a bit of a weakness in how this works, but usually works pretty well. the last thing we should do is have a look at the sky materials. Now I've already turned this on these, but I'd like to show you quite quickly. Is if you look in the mobile section of one of the sky textures, we see mobile on our fog and it's turned off. This is quite important because we're going to add fog to the level, and if this wouldn't have been off, then you wouldn't be able to actually see the sky because the fog would occlude the sky. So by turning this off, we're forcing this material to render in front of the fog, which is good. So make sure you always turn this off on things like sky or distant objects or things like that. Okay, I think we have everything set up we need right now. Yes, I think so. All the other materials you're seeing, they're basically the same thing. This one is exactly the same as this, except to use a different texture. Even the explosion texture, it's pretty much the same thing. We've simply done this. And down at the bottom over here, I haven't done anything at all except adding the base texture. This is a transparent texture, transparent material, but again, because it has an alpha map and because the blend mode is set to translucent, it will automatically detect the alpha and automatically make it translucent. So you really don't have to do anything for these textures except adding the mobile base texture. And that pretty much goes for all of these. All of these are all the same. Really nothing special going on. For example, the rock material, it's really just the rock texture. That's it. And that pretty much goes for all of them. The only ones that are actually a bit different perhaps are the plane, the material for the plane itself, this one, and the water. We can actually have a look at the water. Because what I did for the water is I added in an environment map. You see in the section environment, I've added in a sky texture. So I actually used the same texture I used for the sky, this one. And I added that as environment texture. So it gets a bit of reflection going on. Otherwise I haven't set any properties, haven't done anything at all. So it's all very, very basic. I believe I might have done something similar to the plane. Looking at single winged 01 underscore D0 underscore mat. I haven't added environment there, but I think I've added specular. Yes. So I do have specular on this, but again, it's extremely simple to set it up. I simply set enabled use mobile specular, and I set the mobile specular mask to the alpha, because we have a specular texture inside the alpha map, alpha channel of the texture. So I could have used something else, could have used a separate specular texture, for example. I simply set it to diffuse alpha, enabled it, and that's really pretty much it.